No one at Broadfield Veterans Medical Center wanted to fight for the man in bed 7 of the spinal unit. The attending physician called him a management problem. The physiotherapy coordinator called him non-compliant. The ward administrator called him a resource drain, and she said it in emails rather than to his face, which somehow made it worse. Only one nurse, in cerulean scrubs 2 sizes too large for her lean frame, thought the silence coming from bed 7 was not the silence of a broken man. She thought it was the silence of a man choosing his battles. Before we go any further, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad this one found you. If the story pulls you in, go ahead and hit like, subscribe to Steady Badge's Stories, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. These stories travel farther than I ever expected, and I love knowing where they land. Now let me tell you about Margot Fielding. Gideon Marr had been a warrant officer with the Canadian Special Operations Regiment for 11 years before a vehicle rollover on a gravel road outside Kandahar took the movement from his legs and the willingness to explain himself from his voice. He arrived at Broadfield Veterans Medical Center in Halifax 6 months after the incident with a C5 spinal cord injury, a medical file 3 centimeters thick, and a reputation, circulated quietly among staff before he even reached the unit, for being difficult. Difficult, in this context, meant that he had asked twice why his physiotherapy sessions kept getting rescheduled. It meant he had refused a medication change without a full explanation of the clinical reasoning. It meant his eyes, which had lost none of their operational sharpness despite everything else, had a way of tracking people across a room that made certain staff feel surveilled. Dr. Paul Strachan ran the spinal rehabilitation unit at Broadfield, with the confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in a room he controlled. He was 51. Broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had been athletic a decade ago and hadn't quite accepted the past tense. He reviewed Gideon's chart at the foot of the bed on a Tuesday morning in October, while a cluster of residents stood behind him in attentive silence. 6 months post-injury, no functional motor recovery below C5, Strachan said, not to Gideon about him. We're looking at long-term placement planning. Family has been informed. One of the residents, a young woman named Priya, glanced toward the bed. Gideon's eyes were fixed on the ceiling. His jaw was set. Margot Fielding stood near the medication cart at the far end of the room. She had been at Broadfield for 14 months. In that time, she had learned that the fastest way to survive a unit run by someone like Strachan was to say little, document everything, and be genuinely useful in ways that were hard to dismiss. She wore her hair pulled back without ceremony. Her scrubs were the bright cerulean blue of the hospital's registered nursing staff, and she moved through rooms the way certain people do. Efficiently, without friction, without drawing attention to the fact that she was always watching. She had been watching Gideon Marr for 9 days. Not because anything in his chart alarmed her, though several things had, but because of his left thumb. When the pain came, which it did in waves timed to shifts in his positioning, Gideon's left thumb moved, not dramatically. A small lateral pull, barely visible under the bedsheet. Involuntary, she was almost certain, and it happened at C5 level, which suggested something the imaging had not confirmed and Strachan had not looked for. His thumb has been moving during repositioning, Margot said. The room did not exactly go quiet, because it had already been quiet, but the quality of the quiet changed. Strachan turned slowly, Nurse Fielding. Left lateral movement, C5 dermatome. 8 documented instances over 9 days. She kept her voice level. It's in my notes. Spasm, Strachan said. Common in incomplete presentations, which this is not. His injury classification was based on the admission imaging. He hasn't had a repeat MRI. Strachan's expression settled into something that was not quite a smile. That's because there's no clinical indication. There is now. Priya looked at the floor. The other residents looked at Strachan. Miss Fielding, Strachan said, I appreciate enthusiasm in nursing staff. I don't appreciate diagnostic overreach. Please continue with your medication round. Margot said nothing. She picked up the medication tray, but as she passed bed 7, she paused, not long enough for Strachan to comment on, and looked at Gideon. His eyes moved to hers. Not a request, not a plea, something much older than that, an assessment. She gave him a small nod and moved on. That afternoon, she sat at the nursing station and added 3 more paragraphs to her documentation. Blood pressure variations correlated to neck position, pulse irregularities during morning cares, the thumb. She cross-referenced against admission notes, flagged 2 discrepancies in the physiotherapy records, and sent a message to the unit's neurology consult line requesting a secondary review. The consult was denied. Strachan's name was in the denial. The next morning, she requested it again through a different pathway. That one was also declined. On the 3rd morning, during handover, she was standing near the nursing station when Gideon's monitor alarmed. Heart rate 42, blood pressure dropping. She was in the room before the alarm finished its 3rd cycle. His pillow had shifted during the night. His chin was extended 2 degrees beyond neutral. She corrected the position with both hands and held it. "Easy," she said. "I've got you." His eyes found hers, his heart rate climbed back 50, 54, 60. Strachan arrived in the doorway 90 seconds later, with a look that made clear he considered this theater. "Vagal response," he said, common with his injury level. "His pressure drops every time his neck extends past neutral," Margot said. "I've documented it 7 times. 7 times your documentation reflects an incorrect positioning pattern, yes." She looked at him, then at Gideon. Gideon's lips moved, no sound. She leaned closer because she had learned his face by now, the micro-expressions that preceded any attempt at communication. His lips moved again. One word. She didn't hear it, she saw it. Ridgeline. Margot went very still. Ridgeline was not a word, it was a call sign, and she knew it because she had heard it on a radio in a burning forward operating base in Paktika province, Afghanistan, 14 years ago, while she was hooking herself to an extraction hoist, and the man on the other end of the radio was keeping a dozen Canadian soldiers alive by calling out enemy positions until she could reach them. Ridgeline had been the voice in the smoke. She straightened. "He needs a repeat MRI," she said, "today." Strachan folded his arms. "He needs to be stabilized and returned to a resting position." "He is stable. His neck is in neutral. He's looking at me, he's tracking, he's trying to communicate." She kept her voice even. "That is not the presentation of a C5 complete." Strachan's voice dropped in the way that voices drop when the person speaking wants everyone in the room to understand who has the authority. "You are a nurse, Miss Fielding. A capable one. But you are describing a miracle because you want there to be one." Margot's hands did not move. Inside her, something shifted. Not anger. Older than anger. It was the same thing that had moved through her on the hoist when the landing zone disappeared beneath smoke and she could not see the ground, when the only rational response was to keep going down anyway. "I'm describing documentation," she said, 7 days of it. Strachan turned to the doorway. "Schedule him for family counseling regarding long-term care placement, and please remind Miss Fielding of the chain of consultation." He walked out. Priya lingered in the doorway. She looked at Gideon, then at Margot. "His pressure does drop with extension," Priya said quietly. "I've seen it." "Then document it," Margot said. "Put your name on it." Priya looked at the floor and left. Margot looked at Gideon. "You said Ridgeline," she told him. His left thumb moved. "Yes." "Paktika, 2010. The thumb again. "Yes." She pulled the chair to the side of his bed, sat down, and opened her notepad. "Blink once for yes, twice for no. Can you hear me clearly?" "1 blink. Are you in pain right now?" "1 blink. Is it worse with neck extension?" "1 blink." She wrote it all down, every word, every blink, time-stamped. Then she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." 1 blink. "Did anyone tell you this might not be permanent?" A long pause, then 2 slow blinks, "No." Margot set the notepad down. She had treated blast injuries in field conditions without electricity. She had intubated a warrant officer in the back of a light armored vehicle while it was still moving. She was not by nature someone who frightened easily, but the expression in Gideon Marr's eyes frightened her, not because of what was there, because of what had been allowed to drain away. She leaned forward. "My name is Margot Fielding," she said, "but Ridgeline wouldn't know me by that name." His eyes narrowed, waiting. "They called me Kestrel," she said. The monitor alarmed, not from distress. His heart rate jumped because something in him woke up. She pressed the call bell once. "I'm going to get you that MRI." It took 3 days, 2 formal escalation requests, 1 ethics consultation, and a phone call from Margot to the Veterans Affairs Regional Nursing Liaison, a woman named Carol Beaulieu, who had spent 20 years cutting through institutional walls, and whose voice on the phone was the professional equivalent of a battering ram, before a repeat MRI was scheduled. Strachan fought it at every step. He questioned Margot's clinical judgment in writing, referenced her escalation pattern across 14 months at Broadfield, and in a meeting with the unit manager described her as emotionally overinvested in veteran identity narratives. The unit manager, a man named Howard who had been in the role for 3 months, and was still learning whose battles were worth joining, said very little. Margot documented the meeting, all of it. The MRI happened on a Thursday. The neurology fellow on call, Dr. Yemi Adara, reviewed the images with Strachan in the reading room. Margot stood in the corridor and waited. She did not have to wait long. Adara came through the door first. Her expression was careful in the way of someone controlling a significant reaction. "There's a compression at C4-C5, she said. "Posterior epidural collection, small but present. It's been there long enough to show changes in the cord tissue around it. Margot closed her eyes for 2 seconds. How long? Hard to say without prior imaging at that level, but the tissue response suggests weeks, maybe longer. Strachan appeared behind Adara. His face was composed in the way of someone who has just been told something they cannot afford to accept. One finding on imaging does not constitute a surgical emergency, he said. It explains the autonomic instability, Margot said. It explains the thumb movement. It explains why he hasn't recovered. It explains a finding that requires clinical correlation. He's been in there 6 months with a potentially treatable compression, and you've been planning his discharge to long-term care. Strachan's eyes went flat. You are one bad outcome from the end of your career here, Miss Fielding. Carol Beaulieu had told Margot once, in a different context, that the moment someone threatened your career to stop you from doing your job was the moment your job required you to stop worrying about your career. Margot turned to Adara. What does he need? Adara straightened. Neurosurgery consult urgent. Then let's get it. I have not approved a neurosurgery referral, Strachan said. With respect, doctor, Adara said. The imaging supersedes unit approval. I'm placing the referral under my own name. A pause. You're welcome to document your disagreement. Strachan's jaw moved once. He said nothing. He walked away. The neurosurgeon, who appeared 40 minutes later, was a compact, careful man named Dr. Frank Ossie, who reviewed the images without comment for 6 minutes before looking up. Who identified this? The nursing documentation flagged the pattern, Adara said. Nurse Fielding. He looked at Margot. How long did you track the autonomic instability? 9 days before I could get imaging ordered. 9 days, he looked back at the screen, and he's been here 6 months. Nobody said anything. Ossie turned toward the door. I need to speak with the patient. In the room, he used the blink system Margot had established. 1 for yes, 2 for no. He was methodical and thorough, and he spoke to Gideon as a person, a detail so simple it should have been unremarkable and wasn't. When he finished, he said, I want to decompress the collection. There's no guarantee of recovery, and I won't make promises that aren't mine to make. But the cord doesn't look destroyed. It looks angry and compressed. That's a different thing. Gideon blinked once. Do you understand that surgery carries its own risk? 1 blink. Do you want me to evaluate you for decompression? 1 blink immediately. Ossie looked at Margot. Get consent documented properly. Ethics and legal can work from the blink protocol. Strachan reappeared in the doorway. He cannot provide valid surgical consent through blinking. Ossie turned slowly. He answered 12 questions correctly in sequence, demonstrated understanding of risk and alternatives, and indicated a clear preference. That's more than I get from half my ambulatory patients. A pause. The consent is valid. What followed was 2 hours of institutional friction. Legal wanted forms, administration wanted risk documentation. Strachan wanted, more than anything, for the room to return to the shape it had been when he controlled it. Margot sat beside Gideon while it happened. I need to tell you something, she said. His eyes waited. After Practica, I came home and I left the forces, didn't talk about it. Filed for transition assistance, took a civilian nursing certification upgrade, applied to veterans' facilities because I thought I could still be useful without being Kestrel anymore. She looked at her hands. I was wrong about the last part. You can't just file away the part of yourself that knows how to keep people alive. His thumb moved against the sheet, not the involuntary pull she'd been documenting. Something deliberate, 1 press, acknowledged. You kept that radio alive for 4 hours, she said. His eyes filled. 2 broken ribs, she said. I read the after-action summary. You called positions for 4 hours with 2 broken ribs and nobody coming. His mouth moved. She read it. Someone came. Yes, she said. Someone came. Surgery was scheduled for 6 o'clock. As they rolled Gideon's bed toward the surgical elevators, veterans from the ward gathered in the corridor. Men and women, some in wheelchairs, some onto canes, one very old man in a Korea Veterans Association jacket, standing with both hands trembling on a walker. They did not cheer. They stood. That was enough. Strachan fell into step beside Margot near the elevator. His voice was low. You understand this is not over. For him, I hope it is, she said. For you, I mean. The elevator opened. Margot rolled Gideon inside. As the doors began to close, she saw Strachan's face. The clinical authority was still there, but something underneath it had come loose. She recognized the look. She had seen it on men in the field when the situation stopped going the way they'd planned and they hadn't yet decided what to do about it. It was the look of someone who had just understood they might be on the wrong side of something. The doors shut. In the elevator, Gideon's lips moved. Kestrel. She pressed her hand lightly to the bed rail beside his shoulder. Still here, Ridgeline. The operation lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes. Dr. Osi found the epidural collection exactly where the imaging had shown it. Slightly larger than estimated, compressing a cord that was bruised and angry and, critically, not severed. He drained it with the particular care of a surgeon who knew what was riding on each millimeter of clearance. He found inflammation consistent with a secondary process. Margot would not learn the full pathology for another 72 hours. And he repaired what could be repaired. Margot stood in the recovery corridor when it was over and pressed both palms flat against the wall and breathed until her hands stopped shaking. They had been shaking since the elevator. Carol Beaulieu found her there and said nothing, just stood beside her for a moment in the way of someone who had also done things that caused her hands to shake afterward, and understood that the shaking was not weakness but the body settling its accounts. Then Carol said, "Administration is asking about your suspension." Margot straightened. "When was I suspended?" Strachan filed it during surgery. Unauthorized escalation, disruption of unit clinical hierarchy, professional conduct concerns. Carol's expression was level. He's also filed a complaint with the college. Margot looked at the ceiling. He waited until I was in the corridor and couldn't do anything about it. Yes. K-word. Yes. A pause. The Veterans Affairs liaison is on her way, and there's a Canadian Forces liaison officer in the building, Major Sandra. She was notified of emergency surgery for a serving member's dependent case. Carol paused again. She asked for you by name. She asked for Margot Fielding. She asked for Kestrel. Major Sandra Tessie was 44 years old, slim and precise, and she wore her uniform the way certain people wear their skin, like it had grown there. She met Margot outside the ICU waiting area, with a folder under one arm, and an expression that gave away nothing except that she had learned things tonight that she had come prepared to use. "Master Corporal Fielding," she said. "I haven't been Master Corporal for a long time," Margot said. "No," Tess said. "You've been a nurse." A pause, which as it turns out was a more effective use of your skills than anyone in transition management predicted. Strachan appeared at the far end of the corridor with Howard from unit management and 2 members of the hospital security team. C watched him approach without expression. Strachan addressed Howard. "The nursing staff member in question has been suspended pending investigation. We need to formalize her removal from this unit." Howard looked uncomfortable. He was still learning whose battles were worth joining, and the presence of a Canadian Armed Forces major was not simplifying his education. Dr. Strachan said, "I'm Major Sandra T., CF Health Services Liaison attached to the Veterans Affairs Regional Oversight Committee. Before you formalize anything, you may want to know that the Ethics Board has been notified of Warrant Officer Marr's case, and that I've been in contact with the hospital's legal counsel regarding the documentation trail." She held his gaze. Specifically, the 7 documented requests for secondary neurological review that were denied under your authority. "That documentation reflects clinical judgment calls made within standard protocol," Strachan said. "It reflects 7 instances of a nurse correctly identifying a deteriorating neurological presentation that was dismissed as nursing overreach." Tess opened the folder. Dr. Osi's operative notes describe an epidural collection consistent with weeks of development. "Warrant Officer Marr has been in this facility for 6 months." A pause. "The Ethics Board will want to discuss that arithmetic." The security team had stopped moving. Howard was no longer looking at Strachan. Strachan's voice lost some of its smoothness. This nurse inserted herself into a clinical role outside her scope, built a relationship with a patient that compromised her professional objectivity, and caused significant disruption to a functioning unit. "She kept him alive long enough to get to surgery," T said. "That seems to be within scope." From behind Margot, a voice said, "I'd like that in writing." Everyone turned. Gideon Marr was not awake, but his wife, Heather, was. She was 40 years old, dark-eyed, and looked like a woman who had been scared for 6 months and had just been handed a reason to stop being scared, and was now doing something with all that saved-up adrenaline. She was holding a folder of her own. Carol had been busy. "He has a chance," Heather said to Strachan. "My husband has a chance because she pushed for 9 days while you filed denial letters." She looked at Howard. "I want documentation of every escalation request this nurse submitted and every denial your unit issued. I want it before I leave this building." "Mrs. Marr, this is a clinical," Howard began. "My husband couldn't speak," Heather said. "He couldn't move. He was lying in that bed for 9 days with someone finally paying attention, and your unit was working on discharge planning." Her voice was entirely steady. "Give me the documentation." Howard gave her the documentation. Gideon woke at 20 minutes past 11. Margot was beside him when it happened. The ICU was quiet the way hospitals are quiet at night. Not peacefully but watchfully, Machines keeping vigil in place of sleep. Ridgeline, she said. His eyes opened, unfocused, then sharpened in the way she remembered, that operational shift from unconsciousness to full awareness that takes most people minutes, and had taken him, even in Paktika, about 4 seconds. Surgery is done, she said. Ozzy found the compression, he drained it, the cord isn't destroyed. She watched him process that. Can you feel anything different? A long pause. His left thumb moved. One press. She exhaled. That's new, she said. That's not the involuntary pull, that's you. Another press. She slid a letterboard under his hand. Let's see what else you've got. It took 20 minutes. His right index finger had minimal movement. His left thumb was stronger than she expected. Sensation testing showed preserved pathways at the lateral borders of both feet, sacral sparing, which meant the injury had never been the complete classification Strachan's file described. Dr. Osi came in at midnight, reviewed what she had found, and stood quietly for a moment looking at the monitoring data. Incomplete, he said. He was always incomplete. I know. He should have had the MRI in week 2. I know. Osi looked at Gideon. We'll start intensive rehabilitation in 48 hours once he's stable. He paused at the door. Good documentation, Nurse Fielding. It's what the job is, she said. He smiled slightly. It's what the job should be, not always what it is. After he left, Gideon's hand moved on the letterboard, slow, effortful, letter by letter. Kestrel. She leaned forward, right here. His finger moved again. Stay. She settled into the chair beside the bed. Okay, Ridgeline. His hands stilled, 62 heartbeats on the monitor, steady, his eyes closed. She stayed. The formal review began 3 weeks later. Strachan's unit practices were audited across a 5-year window. Investigators found a pattern of documented nursing concerns dismissed without clinical review. 7 veterans whose rehabilitation classifications had not been updated despite documented functional changes, and a series of referrals to a private neurological research program that appeared in Strachan's external financial disclosures as consulting income. He had not been selecting patients for the program based on their potential. He had been selecting them based on their permanence. Permanent cases were more valuable to a certain kind of research. Permanent cases didn't complicate outcome data by recovering. The college pulled his license pending investigation. The hospital overhauled its escalation protocols. Veterans Affairs Canada issued a directive requiring secondary neurological review for all spinal injury patients within 30 days of admission to federally funded rehabilitation units. The directive was called the MAR Protocol. Gideon stood for the first time between parallel bars 6 weeks after surgery. 23 seconds. His knees shook. Heather covered her mouth. Priya, who had started documenting her own observations after the MRI and had submitted her notes to the ethics board on her own time, stood near the door and looked at her shoes so no one would see her face. Margot stood at the other end of the bars and said nothing. He didn't need her to say anything. When he reached her, he stopped. 23 seconds of standing. Still shaking, he said. Good, she said. Means you're still working. He looked at her. The operational sharpness was back. Everything that had been draining away for 6 months was back. You didn't have to do this. Margot thought about that, about the hoist, about Paktika, about the call sign she had put away like a uniform in a closet and told herself she didn't need anymore. Kestrel doesn't not do things because she doesn't have to, she said. His mouth curved. It was a small movement, still unfamiliar on a face that had learned stillness as a survival tool. She's still around? Margot glanced at her cerulean scrubs, at the ID badge clipped to her pocket, at the ward behind her, full of people who had fought in places that did not appear on television, and come home to institutions that confused silence with surrender. Yeah, she said, she's still around. Broadfield Veterans Medical Center established the Veteran Neurological Rapid Response Program the following spring. With dedicated funding through Veterans Affairs Canada, the program required every spinal injury admission to receive a structured neurological reassessment within 21 days, conducted by a nurse-physician team with mandatory documentation of all functional observations, however small, however easy to dismiss. Margot Fielding was named clinical lead. She still wore cerulean scrubs. She still moved through rooms without friction, but she stopped keeping her eyes lowered around proud men in white coats because she had learned, or perhaps relearned, that some forms of quiet were chosen and some were imposed, and the difference was worth knowing. She pinned a faded Cansofcom medical patch inside her locker door, not to remember where she had been, to remember what she had been told to forget and decided finally not to. She never promised the veterans in her ward that they would walk. She promised them that whatever was still there, in the thumb, in the lateral border of a foot, in the eyes of a man the system had already written a discharge summary for. She would find it, she would document it, and she would not stop until someone listened. In a ward that had learned to mistake stillness for defeat, that turned out to be enough to change everything.